I never thought I'd see the day when my own son would slam a door in my face and lock me out of the very house I built with my own hands. It was the first week of January, the air sharp enough to sting my lungs, and I stood there with nothing but the old navy jacket I'd worn since the 70s. The house looked warm from the outside, golden light spilling through the windows, the kind of glow that usually meant family was gathered inside, but not for me. My son had turned the key, and with one twist of his wrist, he made it clear I no longer belonged. That house by Lake Champlain wasn't just wood and stone. It was 35 years of double shifts at the steel plant in Pittsburgh. It was knees aching from climbing ladders and a back ruined by decades of hauling beams. It was the nights I ate canned beans because the mortgage payment had to come first. Every nail I hammered into that cedar siding was a promise to my late wife that our boy would never know the hunger or cold we grew up with. And now that same boy, my only child, had the nerve to tell me my time was done. He didn't even say it to my face. A week after the funeral, a lawyer's envelope arrived with his handwriting scrawled on the front. Inside was a letter that didn't sound like him at all. Stiff words about inheritance, property rights, and moving forward. At the bottom, his signature was neat, practiced, the way he signed his name when he was applying for Harvard Business School. He had always been meticulous about presentation, but this felt cold, rehearsed, like someone else had guided his pen. I should have seen the signs earlier. He started pulling away after his mother died, dressing sharper, spending weekends in Boston, surrounding himself with people who spoke in numbers and profits. When he came back home, he'd stand in the kitchen I built, sipping imported bourbon and talk about leverage and market opportunities. I didn't understand half of it, but I nodded like any proud father would. I thought, maybe this is what all my sacrifice was for, to see him climb higher than I ever could. Then came the real blow. The lawyer's note didn't just say he inherited everything. It said the house and the accounts, even the investment portfolio I had built slowly over decades, now belonged to him alone. That portfolio wasn't just paper. It was my sweat transformed into stocks, my overtime turned into bonds, my late wife's careful budgeting turned into dividends, and I had trusted him enough to let his name sit beside mine on those accounts. He knew the passwords, the brokers, the contacts. I never thought a son would need to betray his father. At first, I told myself it was a mistake, a formality that could be fixed. But when I drove up the long gravel driveway that frosty morning, suitcase rattling in the back seat of my old Ford, I saw the locks had been changed. A new security system blinked on the porch, one I never installed. I knocked once, twice. He opened the door just enough for me to see the polished hardwood floors I'd sanded with my own hands. Then he said words I'll never forget. "Dad, it's time for you to move on. This house isn't yours anymore." And he shut the door. I walked back to my car, boots crunching against ice, my chest heavy as stone. Sitting behind the wheel, I noticed a stack of envelopes on the passenger seat. They had been forwarded from my old address. The return stamp said Green Mountain Bank. I tore one open. My eyes caught on numbers that didn't make sense, figures in the millions, references to collateral, maturity dates I had never agreed to. The words joint account holder were still there, but so was my name. My son hadn't cut me out entirely. Not yet. That was the first moment I realized something was very wrong. He had locked me out of the house, but he hadn't been able to erase me from the paper trail. And banks, unlike sons, don't forgive mistakes. I didn't say a word to him that day. I drove into Burlington, checked into a cheap roadside motel off E89, and laid the letters across the bedspread. Each page told a story I hadn't been invited into. Mortgages stacked on mortgages, loans pulled against the very house he'd just barred me from, and sums that would make even a seasoned banker sweat. 7 figures, borrowed fast, invested in something I didn't yet understand. I stared at those pages until the words blurred, until the numbers swam, and only one thought settled in my chest. My son hadn't just betrayed me. He had tied both our names to something dangerous, and sooner or later, someone with more power than him would come knocking. 2 weeks later, my phone rang at dawn. The caller ID said Green Mountain Bank, and that was when everything started to unravel. When the bank called, I braced myself. The man on the other end had a steady voice, the kind of calm that meant bad news was coming. "Mr. Dwyer," he said, "we need you to come in as soon as possible. There are irregularities with the joint accounts in your name." I sat there in the motel chair, the phone pressed to my ear, the snow falling in heavy sheets outside the window. The word irregularities echoed in my head. I knew then what my gut had been trying to tell me. My son hadn't just inherited money. He had gambled it, leveraged it, and tied my name to every risky bet. When I arrived at the Green Mountain Bank branch in Burlington, the smell of fresh coffee hit me before I even got to the desk. People in suits hurried past with files tucked under their arms. I felt out of place in my worn boots and faded jacket. But when the manager led me into his office and laid out the papers, I realized I belonged right there. My signature, my name, still appeared on every major transaction. My son had never taken the time to remove me fully. The first twist came as I read the details. He had mortgaged the Lake Champlain house, the house he locked me out of, not once but twice, stacking loans against its value. Over $4 million pulled out in the span of 8 months. And then there were the wires to Miami, hundreds of thousands at a time to a development company I had never heard of. "Your son assured us the returns would be enormous," the manager explained, "but now the payments are late. As a joint account holder, we need your cooperation. That was the polite word for liability. I walked out of that bank with a folder under my arm and a fire in my chest. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my shoulders shifted. He had tried to erase me, but in his arrogance, he had left me tethered to the very rope he was using to hang himself. And now, the bank saw me as the responsible party, the one who could steady the ship, or sink it. That night, I went to the diner down the road, ordered a black coffee, no sugar. The waitress, a woman about my age with kind eyes, noticed my trembling hands. "Rough day?" she asked. I almost laughed. Rough didn't even begin to cover it. I told her a little, just enough to get it off my chest. She shook her head and said, "Blood's supposed to protect you, not bleed you dry." Those words stuck with me. The next twist came 2 days later. My son showed up at the motel. He must have heard from the bank that I was still on the accounts. He walked in like he owned the place, dressed in his tailored coat, smelling of expensive cologne. "Dad," he said, voice low but urgent, "you need to sign some documents." "It'll clear this up." He slid the papers across the motel table. "Quick signatures," he said, "just formalities." But I had already read enough contracts to know better. Buried in the fine print, those signatures would have transferred every remaining asset solely into his name, leaving me to shoulder the liability. He thought I wouldn't notice. He thought age had dulled my mind. I pushed the papers back. "You locked me out of my house," I told him. "Don't expect me to unlock your cage." His face hardened, the charm slipping. "You'll regret this," he said. Then he stormed out, slamming the thin motel door so hard the frame rattled. For a brief moment, guilt clawed at me. This was my son, my blood. I had raised him, sacrificed for him, given him everything. Shouldn't a father protect his child, even from himself? But then I pictured the day he shut that front door in my face, the sound of the lock turning. I remembered my wife's photograph on the mantel inside, now out of my reach. And I knew this wasn't about forgiveness. This was about justice. The next morning, I met with the bank's attorneys. They explained that because my name was still tied to the accounts, I had leverage. I could freeze the funds, demand oversight, even force liquidation of certain assets. My son thought he had written me out, but instead he had left the back door wide open. As I signed the initial documents to halt withdrawals, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, a calm certainty. The same steadiness I used to feel in the steel mill, standing in front of the furnace, knowing the heat would burn anyone who got careless. But then came the final twist of that week. One of the lawyers leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Mr. Dwyer, you should know. If these investments collapse, criminal charges could be involved. Your son could be facing more than just bankruptcy." I drove back to the motel with that sentence echoing in my mind. Bankruptcy was one thing, prison was another. Did I have it in me to let the law take its course, even if it meant watching my son in handcuffs? Or would I use the leverage I now held to teach him a lesson without destroying him completely? That night, as the snow piled high against the motel window, I stared at the bank folder spread across the bed. My son thought he had cornered me. He had no idea I now held the match that could burn down everything he built. And the next move I made would decide whether he lost millions, his freedom, or both. The night after that meeting with the bank, I barely slept. The motel heater rattled like it was about to give out, and the wind howled across the parking lot. I kept staring at the folder of documents on the nightstand, every page proof that my son wasn't just reckless. He was playing with fire that could consume both of us. The words of the lawyer haunted me. Criminal charges. Prison. I tried to picture him in a cell, and my chest tightened. No matter how much he had betrayed me, he was still the boy I taught to ride a bike on those cracked Pittsburgh sidewalks. The boy I cheered for in Little League. The boy his mother once held like he was her whole world. But then the other memory came back, sharper than any knife. Him standing in that doorway, telling me I didn't belong in my own home. That image hardened me. The next morning I made a decision. I drove back to Burlington, this time not to the bank, but to an old friend. Walter, a retired attorney who once worked corporate cases in Boston. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I called, his gravelly voice said, "Come by." "Sounds like you're tangled in something ugly." Walter's living room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. He listened quietly as I laid out the situation, tapping his pen against a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back. "Your son didn't just overextend," he said. "These Miami companies. They're shells, probably money laundering, real estate scams. If he signed on the dotted line and your name is still attached, you're both exposed." The twist hit me like a blow. It wasn't just bad loans, it was potentially criminal enterprises. And because I had trusted my son enough to leave my name tied to everything, I was standing in the quicksand with him. Walter adjusted his glasses. "But here's the thing, Frank. You have leverage. The bank sees you as the safer bet. You could cut him out, work with them, and shield yourself. But that means throwing him to the wolves." I sat there, the weight of the choice pressing down. Throw him to the wolves or let him drag me into the pit with him. 2 days later, the situation escalated. My son's name made the local business journal. Young Investors Miami Development Stalls Amid Rumors of Default. The article was brutal, describing him as a wunderkind who had risen too fast, burned through cash, and now faced ruin. There was even a quote from one of his so-called partners in Miami, calling him naive. My stomach twisted, reading it. The son I raised was being publicly humiliated. But then tucked in the last paragraph, I saw it. A reference to the joint account. My name. That same afternoon, he called. His voice was raw, desperate. "Dad, they're coming after me. I need you to release the funds. If you don't, I'm finished." I could hear traffic in the background, the sharp honking of Boston streets. He was on the move, cornered. And for the first time, I realized he wasn't calling me as a son calls a father. He was calling me like a drowning man, reaching for anything that floats. I asked him one question. "Did you know about the Miami shells?" Silence. Then finally, a muttered, "I thought I could handle it." That confession was the next twist. He wasn't tricked. He wasn't a victim. He had chosen the greed, chosen the gamble. Believing he was smarter than everyone else. He gambled with my legacy, my wife's memory, my blood. I hung up without another word. That night, I returned to the house by the lake. I knew he wasn't there. Neighbors had told me he was hiding out in Boston, trying to salvage what was left. The driveway was buried under snow, the porch light off. I stood there staring at the house, remembering the years I had spent sanding the floors, the smell of cedar when we first built it, my wife's laughter echoing through the hall. Then I noticed something new, a foreclosure notice taped to the door, edges flapping in the wind. My chest tightened. He hadn't told me. The bank was moving faster than even I thought. I peeled the notice off, slipped it into my jacket, and drove back to the motel. By the time I laid it on the bed, my mind was already racing. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. If I didn't act, everything I had built would collapse under his arrogance. So I called Walter again. "If I move first," I asked, "can I take control before it all burns down?" He paused, then said, "Yes. But Frank, understand something. Once you do this, there's no turning back. Your son will see it as betrayal. He'll never forgive you." I let his words hang in the air. Betrayal. The irony nearly made me laugh. My son had betrayed me the moment he turned that key. If saving myself, and maybe teaching him a lesson, meant becoming the villain in his eyes, so be it. The next morning I signed the bank papers. I froze the accounts, cut off his access, and initiated proceedings to seize the assets under my name. By the time the ink dried, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't my son. It was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a voice with a sharp Miami accent said, "Mr. Dwyer, your son owes us. And if he can't pay, maybe you will." The voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost polite, but every word cut like glass. "Your son owes us," the man said, "and if he can't pay, maybe you will." Then the line went dead. I sat frozen in that dingy motel room, staring at the phone in my hand. For weeks, I'd been fighting my son's betrayal, the banks, the lawyers. Now I realized something darker had been waiting in the shadows all along. This wasn't just bad investments. He had tangled with predators, and they had my name too. The next morning, I drove straight to the bank with the foreclosure notice still tucked in my jacket. My breath clouded in the frigid Vermont air as I walked into the marble lobby. The manager greeted me stiffly, probably expecting another desperate old man clinging to the past. But I wasn't desperate. Not anymore. I had leverage, and I was ready to use it. "I want full access," I told him, laying the foreclosure notice on his desk. "You said I'm still on the accounts." "Then I want control. Freeze every cent he can touch." His eyebrows lifted. "That will put your son in an impossible position." I looked him dead in the eye. Good. That's exactly where I want him. By that afternoon, the wires to Miami stopped cold. My son's business partners would see the faucet run dry, and the panic would begin. 2 nights later, it did. I came back to the motel to find him waiting outside, leaning against a rental car with Boston plates. His coat was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, eyes wild in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager caught lying. "You've ruined me," he hissed, shoving his hands into his pockets. They're coming after me now. Do you understand that? They'll kill me if I don't pay." I almost pitied him. Almost. "You should have thought of that," I said, "before you dragged my name into it." His face twisted, and then came the twist I hadn't seen coming. "I didn't just drag your name in, Dad. I put up the lake house as collateral. If you don't release the funds, they'll take everything. Your memories, Mom's memory, all of it." For a moment, the weight of his words crushed me. That house wasn't just property. It was my wife's laughter in the kitchen, the smell of cedar when we first built it, the photo albums in the attic. And he had bet it all. But then I remembered the foreclosure notice already taped to the door, the bank's quiet move to reclaim what was mine. He thought he was holding me hostage with the house, but in reality he'd already lost it. His arrogance had blinded him. I didn't tell him that, though. Not yet. Instead, I let him think he still had a card to play, Because revenge isn't just about striking back, it's about letting them hang themselves with their own rope. That night, I called Walter again. He's desperate, I told him. He's going to make mistakes. Walter chuckled dryly. Then all you need to do is watch, and when he falls, be ready to catch what's left. The next twist came quicker than I thought. The Miami number called again, but this time the tone was different. "Mr. Dwyer," the man said, "we hear you're the one with authority now. Perhaps we should be speaking to you directly." My pulse quickened. They were shifting. They no longer saw my son as the player. They saw me. And that gave me an idea. I agreed to meet them. In public. In a cafe on Church Street in downtown Burlington. Broad daylight. Crowded enough that no one could make a move. When the two men walked in, sharp suits, heavy watches, smiles that didn't reach their eyes, I felt the tension ripple through the room. "You're tougher than your son," one of them said, sipping espresso like it was water. "He panicked." You think I also listen?" I said evenly. "And I know you don't care about him. You care about your money." They leaned closer. "Exactly." That was the twist I'd been waiting for. They admitted it. They didn't want my son. They wanted the cash. And I had the power to decide whether they got it or not. When I walked out of that cafe, the winter sun glaring off the snow, I felt lighter. For the first time, I understood something. This wasn't just my son's mess anymore. It was my stage, and I could decide the ending. Back at the motel, my son was waiting again, pacing like a trapped animal. "Did you meet them?" he demanded. "What did they say?" I looked at him, this grown man who used to be my boy, and I saw the truth. He wasn't afraid for his life. He was afraid of losing the empire he thought he built. "They don't care about you," I told him flatly. "They care about the money. And guess what? I'm the only one who controls it now." He went pale. "You wouldn't." But I already had. That night, I drafted the documents with Walter's help. If I signed them, every remaining cent would shift into my control, and my son would be left with nothing. Not the house, not the accounts, not even the illusion of power. As I set the pen down on the motel desk, I felt the weight of the decision press into me. Was this justice, or was I becoming the very thing I despised? A man who could betray his own blood without flinching? Before I could decide, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't the bank. It wasn't Miami. It was the police. "Mr. Dwyer," the officer said, "we need to talk. Your son's involved in something bigger than financial fraud, and we believe he might have dragged you into it too." The call from the police came just after midnight. Their tone was clipped, professional, but I could hear the urgency beneath it. "Mr. Dwyer, we need you to come in tomorrow morning. Your son isn't just facing fraud charges. We believe organized crime is involved, and because your name is on those accounts, you may be a material witness." I sat there with the motel lamp buzzing above me, the folder of bank documents spread across the bed. I thought about the men in the cafe, the way their smiles never touched their eyes. I thought about my son, pacing like a caged animal, still believing this was about pride and money. And I realized the real twist was this. He wasn't just careless. He was complicit. The next day at the station, the detectives laid it out. They had been watching the Miami shell companies for months. My son's transactions had lit up their radar like fireworks. The loans, the wires, the partnerships. He wasn't an innocent pawn. He had courted them, thinking he could ride their money and connections to make himself a king. But the paper trail told the truth. And because he was sloppy, my name had stayed attached. "You have a choice," the lead detective said, folding his hands across the table. "You can protect him and go down with him, or you can give us what we need. Either way, the walls are closing in." For a moment, the father in me wanted to hesitate. But then the image came back, the door slamming in my face, his voice telling me I didn't belong in my own home. My wife's photograph trapped on that mantel. The foreclosure notice taped to the cedar siding I had built with my own hands. My hesitation burned away. I gave them everything. The bank records, the foreclosure notice, the transcripts Walter had helped me prepare. Every careless mistake my son made, every document that bore his signature. 2 weeks later, it was over. The FBI raided his Boston apartment. News cameras caught him in handcuffs. His once perfect suit wrinkled, his head ducked low. The headlines were brutal. Young investor tied to fraud, facing federal charges. His partners in Miami vanished like smoke, leaving him holding the bag. And the house? The bank sided with me. My name was still on the deeds, still on the accounts. When the foreclosure proceedings hit, they froze my son out and returned control to me. I drove back up that long gravel driveway one last time, the snow crunching beneath my tires, and unlocked the door with a key he thought I'd never hold again. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. My wife's photo was still on the mantel. I set it upright, brushed the glass clean with my sleeve, and whispered, "We're home." The twist, the real final one, came at sentencing. My son stood before the judge, his lawyer arguing that he had been manipulated, that he was too young, too ambitious, but the judge wasn't swayed. "You didn't just gamble with money," she said. "You gambled with trust. And trust, once broken, is the hardest debt to repay." 12 years. That was the sentence. I sat in the back row of the courtroom, my hands folded in my lap. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just felt the weight lift. The years of sacrifice finally acknowledged in a way I hadn't expected. Not through gratitude, not through love, but through justice. I know some people will say I should have protected him, that blood is blood no matter what. Maybe they're right. But here's what I learned. If you let someone use your love as a weapon, they'll cut you open every time. Sometimes the only way to heal is to close the door yourself. That house by the lake is quiet now. I fixed the porch light, restained the cedar siding, and hung new curtains in the kitchen. Every morning I brew a pot of coffee, sit at the table my wife and I once shared, and remind myself that survival isn't betrayal. Survival is honoring the life we built, even if it means letting go of the one person who forgot its worth. I've told you my story because it's the only way I know how to breathe again. Maybe you've been through something similar. Maybe not on this scale, but betrayal is betrayal, whether it costs you dollars or dignity. If you have, I'd like to hear it. Share it in the comments. Sometimes, speaking it out loud is the first step to healing. And if you want to walk through more stories like mine, stick around. Hit subscribe, not for me, but for the reminder that no matter how dark it gets, there's always a way forward.